Welcome to Casual Conversations. My name is Katherine Snedaker. I'm very happy to have you here today. It's our 41st episode of Casual Conversations, and we're hosted by IBIA and NABIS. We always thank the team there for their help. Today, I would like to welcome somebody who I don't know how I would have survived the last couple of years without, Hope Kent. Hi, Hope.
Hi, Katherine.
Hope has been part of PINK Concussions for, I think, 3 or 4 years now. And Hope originally started helping out with our domestic violence task force and doing the notes. So if you've seen Hope's notes, this is Hope. And the magical connection, I think, between us is Huw Williams, true?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Huw definitely introduced me to PINK and introduced me to you. And he was speaking on the domestic violence task force and volunteered my note taking. So I feel like I'm losing my anonymity tonight.
Get pulled in. Well, before we discuss how incredibly helpful you've been with PINK Concussions, let's start. Where did you grow up, and when did science or public health, or what started you on this track when you were little?
I grew up, I'm from England, if you can't tell from my accent, and I grew up in a place called Cheltenham. And I've always loved science. It was always my favourite lesson at school. I was like the kid who was in science club and like every sort of robot club and anything like that. And my background is really in clinical psychology. I did a clinical psychology undergraduate degree, and then
psychology. Just of all the classes, you just walked into psychology and said, "This is it."
I mean, I think psychology sort of appealed to me as soon as I learned it was a subject and you could study what people did and why they did them. And like, I've always been really interested in mental health, and it's something that I've always been quite passionate about, and that's affected people in my life. So I wanted to learn more about that. So I started doing psychology when I was sort of 16, 17, 18, and it was just the subject that combined that like love of people and understanding why people do the things they do, and then the love of science as well. So being able to do both of those things at once was really great.
Where are you in your current education process? Because I always forget you haven't finished it.
No, I haven't. No. So I did my undergraduate degree in clinical psychology, and then I worked in mental health for a little bit. I worked in our NHS, so our National Health Service, treating people with depression and anxiety. And then I decided I wanted to go back into more research. So Huw, who we mentioned earlier, has been my biggest support all the way through my education journey. I did a master's with Huw, and then I worked as a research assistant for him. And now he's supervising my PhD, which I'm currently in my second year of. And enjoying it so far.
How long is the PhD track in the UK?
So it varies a little bit, and my funding is for 3 years and then an additional 6-month placement. So I'm going to be doing it for about 3.5 years. So the placement I actually was lucky enough to do with a company called Do It Profiler, who do screening for neurodisability on entry into prison. So that was like really fascinating, and I got to do some more on the ground work in prisons and things. So that was really nice. When
did the prison piece come along in your pathway and you realize that key component? Because I do believe that there are people in this space that help people and love people, but they never get to that prison piece.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, again, the justice system has always been something I've been quite interested in, and in particular sort of children in the justice system. And Huw, his area of special interest is brain injury in the justice system. So when I worked in the NHS, I sort of became quite aware of like health inequality and inequality in outcomes for different groups of people. And I remember working quite specifically with a gentleman who had a brain injury, and he was really having difficulty accessing healthcare services. He was from the traveller community, and in the UK, travellers are often quite marginalised, quite ostracised, and he was finding that healthcare services were completely inaccessible to him, or inappropriate, or didn't understand his background. And he actually ended up going on to be arrested and end up in the justice system. And that, like, really, I thought about that a lot. And he was like, I think everybody has a patient who they work with and then they go like, oh my gosh, that shouldn't have happened, like it was so avoidable. And for me, that sort of really sparked that interest. And I think I noticed that all of the healthcare inequalities I was seeing are amplified like 100 times in the justice system. And like, some children are just born into situations that mean they have poorer life outcomes, and there's things that can be done so much earlier to support children and stop them ending up in the justice system. And I think as well, the justice system is such a harmful outcome, like going to prison or having any sort of that experience is really traumatic and has a lasting impact on children and young people who end up there, and really impacts their life chances for the rest of their lives, like however long they go to prison for. So that sort of really drove my interest, I think. And then Huw is obviously perfectly placed to facilitate that, and we work together in that area. So yeah.
And how, when you're looking at a system that's so systemically debilitating and is crushing the most vulnerable, marginalized people, where does Hope the person jump in, and like what's your personal mission within that space? Because there are a lot of people that'll be like, that's just like people being dumped in a trash can, that is way too big to handle. But you speak about it in a way and inspire others to learn about it. And you've definitely done that for me. So, talk about the potential you see to change this.
Yeah, I think it's very, like, I definitely have days where I get overwhelmed by the problem. And I think you like sometimes look at the situation and it's such a cumulative situation. So a child who has a brain injury in a loving, supportive family unit, who have resources to access care, who has really great education opportunities, they're going to have completely different outcomes to a child who has a brain injury, is in foster care, has experienced abuse, has like histories of complex trauma, and then doesn't fit into their education system, and isn't reached by services. Then they're going to have a completely different outcome. So it's all about that sort of cumulative effect, and that can definitely feel overwhelming, because like, where do you even start, which issue do you begin with, and how do you begin to support these children? But I think for me and my PhD, I've got a big focus on the education system. I think a lot of the time we're asking teachers and schools to have this wraparound care for children that they don't necessarily have the facilities to support. So all of these children at some point somewhere have education of some kind, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to intervene earlier in education, and to identify these children earlier who are vulnerable, to implement earlier screening, and then to have much more support there. So for example, that there's a new secure school which is being set up in the UK, and that's instead of a young offenders institute. And I think that's such a positive move, to have somewhere for troubled children to go that's not called a young offenders institute. They're not labelled as young offenders. It's a secure school. It's an environment that's designed to facilitate more engagement and learning. And that's being set up at the moment, so it should open in the next couple of months by a charity called Oasis Reform. And like, the guys running the school seem to really have the right idea about it, and it seems like it's going to be a really positive step. So that's just obviously one example of how we can build better support networks around these children. But there's so many, because the problem's so big, there's so many moments where you can make a difference and where you can change that child's trajectory, if that makes sense. You can sort of flip that on its head. Absolutely.
And I think with the socialized medicine, you can track outcomes over time. So you really can, and the same with the Australian work, is that you can see, how a traumatic brain injury changes somebody's trajectory, to finishing school, to what kind of job, to, involvement in the criminal justice system, how long one lives. And I think that those connections are a lot more clear than in our system, where I think the tracking is less clear. And if you can intervene early enough and, just get that there 2 or 3 degrees, I think a younger person will change that trajectory.
Absolutely. And I think one of the best studies I've read recently that really illustrated that was done in the USA, and it's a 2019 study by, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but Nagal, I've really never read it, and colleagues. And they basically did a records check for emergency departments. And they identified children who had a moderate or severe brain injury that was likely to lead to some sort of lasting disability, some sort of lasting impact that was going to have an effect on that child in the future. And they identified 145,000, I think, in the US. So children aged 0 to 19 who had presented at the emergency department with something that was going to cause that kind of lasting disability. And then they did a record search for children who were receiving special educational support for TBI. And that number was much closer to 25,000. I think it's about 24,000. So that's less than 1 in 5 of those children with a moderate severe brain injury is receiving special educational support for TBI. And to me, that was so striking. That's not the mild brain injuries that might have an impact in the classroom. That's there's really going to be some sort of lasting disability there. And that is indicative of this whole population of children who are trying to navigate the education system without the proper support for TBI. And the impact of that in the classroom is going to be really extensive. I think we have to really, when we're thinking about that in children, it's a social state, it's how they navigate the world that's being affected by that lasting disability. So I think that's really important. There's this population of children who are not necessarily getting the right support, who might be misinterpreted as being naughty or not behaving, not listening, not engaging socially. And that's just so key, because those children are likely to go on potentially to be excluded from school, potentially to be referred in the UK to pupil referral units. I'm not sure what the equivalent would be in America. But then again, we know that children who are excluded, children who are referred to pupil referral units, are likely to go on to have prison contact later on. So yeah, I just think it's so important.
Yeah, and there's a cost of keeping large numbers of our population in prison. And if that money, how long does it to keep somebody in prison for 60 years as opposed to putting that money into earlier childhood intervention programs in some way to change those trajectories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Huw always quotes a cost that's I think it's £645 for a child in the UK to go to a Young Offenders Institute. Well, how much do you need to pay a teaching assistant to give that child one-on-one care? It's definitely not that much. And also, it's not just about reducing crime, but you have to think about it in terms of reducing victims as well. The more diversion you can do, the better that is for every member of society. And I think quite often politically it gets misframed as being soft on crime and all of this sort of thing, where it's actually it's better for everybody if we put this intervention in place earlier. There's no child that deserves to be in prison, and nobody deserves to be the victim of crime. And it's just really holistically makes sense to put that support in earlier.
And this is where brain injury really starts to merge with so many other issues, where if you have one parent with a brain injury that's parenting, or you have two parents with brain injuries that are parenting, or you have a situation of domestic violence where one partner has inflicted violence on another, and then you have kids there, and you have multiple people within the same space that have brain injury and are abuse going on, and again, where is that in marginalized communities that don't have support? And I'm starting to learn about maternal and family care and the disparities. If you are a young mother and you don't have the support you need, your toddler falls and has a brain injury, and then there's this sort of how all of these pieces kind of fit together, that brain injury isn't a separate thread, it's threaded within neurodiverse people, in people with ADHD and people with domestic violence, and all of these threads. So it's really, I think it's where brain injury comes out, as part of the fabric of families.
Yeah, definitely. And there's such an intergenerational effect there. And again, if we go back to the justice system, if you have a parent with a brain injury who ends up in the justice system, they're then being separated from their family, and the brain injury might reduce chances of engaging with like family-based rehabilitation. And often, again, in the cases of mothers who maybe have been victims of domestic violence, there's far fewer women's estates, and for that reason they end up being often held quite far away from families, which make family visitations really difficult if you're sort of 200, 300 miles away. Economically and from a time perspective, it's really hard to keep mothers engaged with their family and interacting with their children with any kind of quality whilst they're in prison. And there's been a few instances in the UK at the moment with mothers like giving birth in prison and pregnant women being sent to prison and things, all of which are just really not conducive for a safe parenting environment and an environment that's going to reduce that intergenerational transmission of trauma and, like you say, those family environments that are unsafe or are open to abuse.
But I think also there's a new awareness of how, an awareness of neurodiversity, more of awareness of brain injury, and other than, white male football players. I mean, I just personally feel, and it'd be interesting to hear from people on the call who, have a different generational view on this, but I feel like a lot of this is coming together.
Yeah, definitely. And like in the UK, we actually just had the Ministry of Justice, who run our prisons, they just published a review of the evidence on neurodiversity. So they accepted that this is an issue, and they've done a review which essentially had a series of recommendations based on, like, we need to screen for neurodiversity, we need to have more strategies in place, more pathways, more training for staff. Like, there was a series of things they suggested, more evidence collections, they need to know more about prevalence and things. But that report was such a milestone in trying to get this issue on the map, and it was really, really important for the UK. And we also have another sort of bill going through Parliament at the moment, pushed by Chris Bryant, about brain injury and having a more broad brain injury strategy for the UK. And I think one of the challenges we're facing at the moment in the neurodiversity review is keeping brain injury on the map when there are so many neurodiverse conditions that have so many similar functional difficulties, and prison staff are sort of faced with this situation where they're expected to be experts in ADHD and autism and brain injury and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and all of those things are important. So how do we balance what we screen for, how we protect against those things, and how we safeguard people in prison who do have disabilities? So that's one of the things we're grappling with at the moment.
And there's a recent paper out on the connection with ADHD and brain injury, and just thinking back of the different clinics that I've worked in and what this particular paper said. And I think they looked at a scoping review that I think in the end was about 52 or 42,000 cases. And what they really found is that in mild to moderate TBI, when ADHD was seen after moderate to mild to mild, it really found out that was ADHD that had been in that child or teen's life, and it had never been screened for. Like they just missed it. So after the brain injury, it was popping up and really needed to be treated like ADHD, where you have medications and a whole slew of things. And then in the far side of moderate to severe TBI, they were seeing ADHD coming from the brain injury itself. And I just thought that was, just starting to put these things in categories could really be helpful to a clinician, and a family, and speaks to the screening aspect.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And I'd be very interested to see what the gender differences there are, given gender differences in ADHD diagnoses in girls and boys, and in the classroom, how that presents differently. And again, whether or not that screening difference is there. And yeah, like really, really important. And I think there's sort of moves in the education system that don't necessarily always match what's happening elsewhere, like in a GP's office, or then conversely in the justice system, where we sort of have special educational needs categories. So again, I think they might be different in the US, but in the UK, we have a category. So we would have a category for autism spectrum disorders, for example. But then we would also have a category which is called social, emotional, and mental health. And sort of children will be referred to that category with behavioural problems or behaviours. and behaviour isn't really a helpful diagnosis for anybody. And it's quite difficult then for people to navigate and manage. So in some ways, having that that diagnosis is really helpful for children, can be quite empowering for families. But in other ways, diagnosis is problematic because obviously you have to sort of hit a particular threshold, and often there's a lot of comorbidity there with different neurodisabilities. So somebody with one neurodisability might also have something else as well, and neither of them perhaps meet symptom threshold. So actually really picking apart how to manage that in different environments and different situations. So we're finding in the justice system that what frontline staff want to know is this person's got a problem with attention, rather than this person has a diagnosis of ADHD, because one's more helpful for them when they're planning somebody's day-to-day routine. Or this person's going to have difficulty with short-term memory. This person needs a calm environment when you give them instructions so that they don't have any background noise. And so it's really, the screening varies so much depending on what somebody needs. And screening can be like access to support pathways as well. So for example, in a prison, if you have a diagnosis, it often opens up pathways of support out for you. Whereas if you're sub-threshold, or it's never been picked up, it's never been screened for, you don't get access to those same resources. So it's a really fine balance, I think.
No, absolutely. And I have never had a woman, and at this point it's probably been a couple of thousand women and I've spoken to over 12 years. I've never had a woman that said, wow, I wish I wasn't diagnosed with a brain injury. That this makes sense for what I'm experiencing, and my diagnosis was missed, or people didn't believe me, or they thought I was malingering. I also have spent the last year pretty much every day running an international support group for people with ADHD. And, definitely people being diagnosed with ADHD that are pretty angry about it don't necessarily want it, but over time in a peer support group, find commonality. So I do feel like screening opens pathways, opens community, as long as it's used in a proper way and, in a social justice perspective, right? Because I think some of these labels have been used in the past in very negative ways. So it's a balance, and it's having, people trust that we're screening you for this and this is going to be the outcome. We aren't going to take your kids away, or, that these screenings open people's lives rather than closing them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there is a whole population of people who find, either whether it's the term neurodiversity or whether it's an individual diagnosis, you find that incredibly empowering, and it brings people together, and you can find people who are like you, and sort of having a diagnosis gives you that tool to be able to identify other people who might be like you and find groups of people who you connect with. And I think that's really key. But often in the justice system, we're working with people who are not empowered at all, and particularly children whom systems have acted upon these children over and over again, or discriminated against these children, or criminalized these children. And actually they don't have that sense of empowerment from the diagnosis. Often it could be problematic, like you say, and particularly for women who are facing court cases about their children, if the diagnosis can be used against them, like having a brain injury means this woman's likely to be impulsive, then actually that could be a negative thing for her. So it's really important. I do think that people always have the right to know. So if there's a chance to be screened and it's something that you can be told, like you say, women aren't going to say, I wish I didn't know that. Like, it's something that's really important that you have the right to know. It's just doing it in a way that's sensitive and ethical and empowering for that person, rather than something that's going to prevent them engaging.
Yeah, and just starting where the person is. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be happy they have a diagnosis, but I think in the long term, it's identify something and then you learn to work with it. There's a question from Dr. Johnson. Is there evidence in the UK suggesting that a sustained TBI increases the risk of criminal justice system involvement, particularly in children? And do you know the stat on that one?
So there is a lot of evidence. So Huw Williams actually did a review in the Lancet Psychiatry in 2018. It's called Traumatic Brain Injury, a Potential Cause of Violence Crime. And it's a really good review. It sort of summarizes all of the evidence that's out there, but there's quite a lot of longitudinal studies. And in general, we find that if you sort of sum all of those studies up, it's about 2 to 3 times more likelihood of justice system involvement if you have a TBI. And you sort of have to take that in the context of, you know, TBI disproportionately affects people with low socioeconomic status, people with disrupted family lives and things. So there's confounding variables in there, but the longitudinal stuff does sort of confirm that TBI is a risk factor for justice system involvement. I think quite importantly as well, TBI also often has an impact on children's rights within the justice system too. So if a child does come into contact with the justice system, then the court process can be incredibly difficult to navigate and understand anyway as a child. But if you have a brain injury as well and you're not making eye contact with the judge, or like there's so many procedures to go through, you have to hold information about your rights in mind whilst also talking about what happened and presenting yourself well and making a case. And then you have to get through all of the administrative side of things, so like postal charges and things you have to be able to respond to properly. And there's so much to do that disadvantages children with disabilities even more than children anyway in the justice system. And then once you're in the justice system, there's research showing that if you have a brain injury or a neurodisability, often you're subject to harsher punishments, longer sentences, harsher sanctions within prison. And that sort of comes from those social nuances of appearing like you're not listening to the prison officer, or not remembering your appointments for probation, or not being able to, again, have those social cues to be able to make your case as to why you did something when and how you feel about it. And like all of those little nuances that happen in the justice system, again, like have an impact. So TBI increases children's risk of contact with the justice system, definitely. And then it also makes the outcomes worse within the justice system as well.
And then you add to that skin color, you know, immigration status.
Absolutely.
You know, whether you're going with a parent or a foster parent, you know, like, is the person in charge of your care caring for 6 other children, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, or are you in residential care? Like, do you even have a foster parent that's advocating for you? And particularly for children coming into custody and things, obviously they have to have an appropriate adult with them. But for some children, that could be a parent that arrives 5 minutes after they did and sits with them and talks to them and tells them what's going on and explains what's happening. And for other children, that could be an advocate who arrives 20 hours later at the time of the interview and nobody's spoken to them in those last 20 hours. Like, the whole experience looks very different for children from different backgrounds.
Absolutely. I wanted to just segue to the video that I'm going to put up tonight, which is the next day of events that we taped on July 28th within the IBIA World Congress on Brain Injury. And this was a day called Behind Locked Doors, IVP, Interpersonal Violence,
Intimate partner.
Intimate partner, I do that. Intimate partner violence and domestic violence related brain injury, and then TBI in women in prison. So would you like, since you had such a lovely review, just want to let people know what's contained in the video that we'll be releasing tonight?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this was such a brilliant event, and you know, I was really proud to be a part of this, and I think it's something that I really enjoyed, and I think our audience really enjoyed as well. So the content is fantastic and it's really insightful, and I think it's, you know, really important to bring together these two populations of women with brain injuries as a result of intimate partner violence, and women in the justice system with brain injuries. And quite often, you know, those women are the same. The women in the justice system disproportionately have their brain injuries resulting from domestic violence. So these are two groups that we really drew out a lot of links between. We identified that they're facing the same sort of issues in under-recognition, lack of screening, lack of support, underrepresentation in research.
Wow, you home and more?
Somebody unmiked.
Oh no, that's okay. So there are so many of the same barriers facing these women, and it was brilliant to make those links. So do you want me to just go through who the speakers were, Catherine?
Yeah, and just, a sentence or so about, what, or I could actually read that, whatever you like.
Yeah, sure. So talking about women who are victims of intimate partner violence, we had Stephen Casper, who I love listening to Stephen. He's a medical historian, and he, I think, has been on the task force before, but maybe not a casual conversation.
Yes, he has, and it's his paper, which we are included in, which is lovely. Kelly O'Donnell and Stephen Casper have a paper called "The Boxer and the Punch Drunk Wife."
Yeah, which is brilliant. And he sort of talks about the medical history of gender representation in brain injury research. He sort of talks about how brain injury was first identified in boxers in the early 1900s and has been recognized as a problem. It's been linked to like later life outcomes and things in boxers. And then he talks about how society knew about domestic violence and it was a debated topic, and but nobody ever really made those links between the two until a letter to the Lancet in the 1990s, explaining symptoms of a punch-drunk wife who'd been a victim of domestic violence. So he really compares the medical literature and talks about how underrepresented women were and have historically been, and also what a difference that might have made. And he also made a really great point about thinking about which groups in our society today might be underrepresented and what the long-term impact of that might be. So again, that's women with intimate partner violence, women in prison, and then also potentially groups like homeless women, Indigenous women, like Black women, who are also traditionally underrepresented in research. There's really key groups there. So yeah, and then we had Eve as well, who I know has been on here, who is just such a brilliant leading researcher in intimate partner violence and brain injury in women. I feel like she kind of needs no introduction, but she is always like so powerful when she talks and presents these statistics that are just incredible. I think she always says that 1 in 3 women have been affected by intimate partner violence, and the chances are that, most of those have an ongoing brain injury or have experienced a brain injury of some kind. And I just always find her so striking to listen to, and she talks about her current brain injury research in the US. And then Lee is in South Africa, and Lee again is really brilliant. She's doing research on brain injury as a result of intimate partner violence in South Africa, and South Africa as a country sort of has that real big issue with gender-based violence, and she talks about the prevalence and she talks about how important it is, and she also talks about race as a factor as well. South Africa sort of had a racial apartheid for a long time, which has still had lasting impacts and lasting effects on society, but she talks about it brilliantly and explains that lasting impact and lasting effect, and it's really, really interesting. So yeah, definitely recommend listening to her talk. And then Neka, who was on a couple of weeks ago, is that right, Catherine?
Absolutely. And each of these are 10-minute talks. And I'm trying to figure out whether, I think I'm going to launch it as a 1-hour video and then just have timing. If you were just interested in one of the talks, that you could go to that. If you feel very strongly that you would like to see them broken up, definitely throw that in the chat. But I think at this point, because that was sort of the first hour, and then we took a break, and then we did the second hour, which your picture should be up here. I don't know. I think I made this early enough that, and you then described the morning in that second video, and then Huw.
Yeah, so Huw is my supervisor, and his work in the justice system's just really quite seminal. Like he really pushed forward the research and advocated for people with brain injury in the justice system. And he talks about some really shocking statistics, and he talks about why people with brain injury are more vulnerable to justice system contact. He wrote that review I just mentioned, so if you're interested in those links, definitely listen to Hugh's talk. He's just so charismatic and wonderful to listen to, and he's such a great mentor, and I think that really comes across in that he is such a good teacher, and like the work he talks about really links together those barriers for women and barriers for engagement, barriers to screening, barriers to rehabilitation, and he dismantles that all quite nicely. And then we had Tom Mcmillan. He's based in Scotland, and he's doing, again, just really seminal work in women in the justice system, and he's great to listen to. He just did a study in Scottish prisons where they found that 78% of women in the justice system had experienced a significant TBI, and about 40% of those had like ongoing associated disability from their TBI. And domestic violence was the cause of about 90% of those TBIs. So again, he just talks about that work, and it's brilliant. And he's really insightful in the roundtables as well, with his thoughts on screening and pathways out.
There's a couple of questions in the chat about that relationship with TBI and domestic violence. And depending on the study, it's 60 to 90% of women who experience IPV, domestic violence, have suspected to have brain injury. And then the next statistic that is quoted is that in a household where one partner, generally a man, but not always, man abusing a woman, that 50% of the time the kids will also be abused. I haven't seen the breakdown of, in the abuse in kids, how much of it causes brain injury. I bet the Australians might have some of that. So, because they have a lot on family violence. So but with domestic violence going on in the house, generally the statistic is 50% of the kids are also experiencing that violence. And somebody put in the chat, of course, Nat put in the chat that children also learn by example of the violence, that they learn from the model how to control another person. So that just that exposure to that violence, and how does that make them grow? Why don't you just give us a little bit on Bethany, and then we'll do to Sarah, and then we'll open up the UK piece.
Yeah, sure. So Bethany is, she's also from the UK, but she's working in New Zealand at the moment. And she's working on developing screening tools, and she has a real focus on how to make screening tools like properly accessible and appropriate. So in New Zealand, they're using screening tools for Indigenous women from New Zealand. And she's set up a model where it's all informed by, the questions are designed by the women that they're trying to screen, and that's so important. And she talks about advancing accessibility and appropriateness, really, of tools and measures. She's actually designed her own measure for neurodiversity as well, which is really interesting. So yeah, Bethany's brilliant to listen to, especially if you're interested in screening and how to do that appropriately.
And then Sarah, who's part of Disabilities Trust, and then we'll open up and talk about what's going on in the UK right now.
Yeah, sure. So Sarah is, like Catherine said, part of the Disabilities Trust, which is a really large charity in the UK who've done some incredible work on brain injury. So they developed the Brain Injury Screening Index, which is a tool, and they have sort of published some papers about brain injury in women in prison, and they developed a link worker service to support women in prison with brain injury, and did some qualitative work collecting quotes about how brain injury had impacted women's experiences navigating the criminal justice system, and navigating life before the criminal justice system as well. And their research is just really striking in terms of the massive impact that brain injuries had on all aspects of these women's lives. And Sarah works quite closely with Joss Gaynor, who is coming on Casual Conversations hopefully in a month or so. So you can definitely ask them more about that, but they're launching a new project on domestic violence and brain injury coming up as well. So they're really pioneering in this area too. So Sarah's got some really great results to talk about in the video.
And there seems to be so much in the UK. I mean, I know that initially people didn't think the bill would get very far, and so much support, so much social media around it, different organizations supporting this bill, and organizations that may not necessarily have worked together in the past. So within that, we decided that it was time to launch PINK Concussions officially in the UK and the EU. And I'm so excited that you will be our first boots on the ground, official PINK Concussions person and be head of that UK piece.
Yeah, I'm so excited as well. Thank you. Really grateful for the opportunity, and really pleased to be more involved in PINK and to push PINK's world domination.
World domination. So I was like, what do you want? I go, just world domination, but it really has been true. And when I was there in 2019, and we worked with the BBC and BBC Scotland to try to amplify Dr. Willie Stewart's efforts to have brain pledge from female athletes, but female along the spectrum, got a lot of support. And as women's sports in the UK continues to advance, and this awareness of TBI and this awareness of brain injury, it just seems like a really great time to, just make sure that we can amplify the messages going on in the UK outside of the UK, but also make sure we keep the focus on women and marginalized women within that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is so much happening in the UK at the moment with the brain injury bill, like you said. The UK Acquired Brain Injury Forum have been really key in that. And then there's charities as well, Headway and the Disabilities Trust, and so many people advancing the work and such great academic work going on. The sports piece is becoming stronger in the UK as well. We have loads of sports research going on at the moment. And I think it really gives us the opportunity to advocate for women in that research and make sure that women are centered in the research and that we do look at gender differences in outcomes and sex differences in outcomes. And I think it, again, is just going to be a great platform that people can ask for advice from PINK Concussions, and we can advise what's going on, and that's fantastic. And then also we can do our advocacy and be more involved in conferences that have different audiences, and then also just really support women, again, on a wider level and reach further around the world. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really great opportunity. I'm excited.
And it doesn't seem like COVID do you think COVID has slowed down all of these pieces? Because this is all coming together because people have been doing work for decades, like, these are the fruits of a lot of labors of people whose names probably won't even ever be attached to that final projects. But, do you think this was just coming down the track anyway? Or do you think COVID, in a sense, brought a lens on marginalized women and where they were in the workforce and domestic violence and those pieces?
So I think, like you say, this is years and years that this has been in the pipelines, and I know of organisations who've been advocating so hard for so long to put brain injury on the map, and the Ministry of Justice review again is years. And I feel like we're at a point now where we've identified the problem in the UK, and these new reviews and bills and things are brilliant because they identify that there's a problem, and now we're at a real turning point where we have to find a solution, and we have to inform a solution over the next 10 years. That's the next stage in this process. So in terms of the impact of COVID, I think it sort of sparked an evaluation of our justice systems, our healthcare systems, our social care systems, and how we operate in that sort of emergency, what our priorities are, and then how we wanted to rebuild from that as well. Sort of any sort of structural organisation that was needed. Prisons particularly were operating on basic regimes, and our resources were so stretched. So I think there's been a lot of opportunity for reflection and a lot of opportunity to identify points for change, and it's almost like rebuilding now as we sort of come out of the end of COVID, but rebuild from COVID. I think as well the domestic violence sort of pandemic that was shadowing the COVID pandemic got a lot more publicity, and people started to become aware of that. And in particular, researchers were turning a focus to that. And that has been a springboard again to reevaluate our social care systems and to look at how we support women who are victims of domestic violence. And I remember there being a moment in the COVID regulations in the UK where they added an addendum to say you can leave the house if you're at risk or if you're in a violent home. And that was when nobody was allowed to leave the house. So things like that became more important and came towards the forefront, and that always inspires more public conversation, more research, hopefully more funding, and like again helps to propel things forward. So in some ways I think COVID sort of provided that opportunity for reflection, and now we need to look at how we move forward from that, if that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, and I think move forward with maternal family health, and the whole setting of job. I mean, I feel like there's a sense. I feel like that COVID has connected a lot of dots for a lot of people and across multiple countries. On the PINK Concussions site, I have, which has never really become more than a list, but I listed starting in China, and as COVID kind of spread across the world, I was following and posted articles about the increase of domestic violence as it moved, sort of the shadow epidemic on top of the shadow pandemic. And I do think that there is a new awareness, and it's not just around that particular sports star did that particular thing in an elevator, or that, the cases that gather attention because one of the people was very important. But it's like, oh, it's a problem because it's football players, or it's a problem because it's those people in Baltimore, or, like that the pandemic has really shown the global across all socioeconomic and I think really shown the vulnerability of women, of how many roles women play in society and how our safety nets are not that strong.
Yeah, right, absolutely. And I think that sort of division of home labor, even like in the academic world, looking at women who are in academia who then suddenly were also homeschooling and like cooking meals and all of that sort of stuff, like the people face such different barriers, and there was a gender split to those barriers in terms of the role that women play and how affected they were by that sort of sudden change in lifestyle. So I think, yeah, there's so many angles that have been opened up through COVID, and like you say, I think awareness has massively increased, and it's that piece that Eve talks about where actually it could happen to people the chances are it has happened to people that and that's always something that strikes me and makes you sit and think like, gosh, like who do I know that's been a victim of this? And actually it is out there, and it is everybody, and all women need to unite behind that and provide that support and raise awareness and do the advocacy and everything like that. So it's really important.
And if you missed NECA's presentation, I think it was 2 weeks ago, NECA runs the first nonprofit by survivors of violence for survivors. And so really, I mean, I hadn't spent that much time on our website, which I did this weekend, and there's so much there and there's ways to get involved. So, and we talked about NECA's so fabulous. We talked about her and the concept, but we didn't really, and I think enough talk about Women in the Center, which is in Toronto, but it is an international organization. So definitely check out Women in the Center. And it's the English E where center ends in the E, not the R. I also think the connection of international, like I've always followed medical research out of Israel. They've always had amazing stuff, but not as necessarily other people did. And so I think that as COVID has, especially the United States, which tends to be very insular, and, it's got to come from us if it's, if it's the best, and I think there's more of a global awareness as waves have come through and what different countries have tried different things. So I do find that I feel like we're all more connected internationally. And again, that's why connecting to the EU and the UK enough to say, we have people on the ground, and you're amazing. And the only reason why there's a PINK Concussions book, which is still at the publisher, is because Hope and Mamie sat down with me weekly with assignments to get the darn book. So whether the publisher decides to publish it or we decide to self-publish, we will have a book in hand by August is our goal now. I'm checking the chat. Kara, they're good to see you. Oh, thank you for putting Women at the Center. And I've just seen how domestic violence shelters or disabilities were unavailable, underfunded, waitlist. Yay for the book. Are there any questions Kara, that you want to throw in for Hope, or anybody that wants to put their hand up and ask a question? Hi, Alicia.
Hi. I didn't know if I was supposed to raise my hand on the thing or just raise my hand. Thank you so much for being here, Hope. And I'm really enjoying this conversation. And on several of these PINK Concussions chats, I've found myself coming back to really just seeing again and again this trend of what, to me, in my personal experience as a TBI survivor, a female TBI survivor, I have experienced as both gender discrimination as well as disability discrimination, because our invisible injury is so hard to really grapple with. And there's so much social misunderstanding and ignorance, frankly, about what it is that we're facing. And I definitely think in the criminal justice system, and I've experienced this myself again, that those two factors, gender discrimination and disability discrimination, contribute tremendously to injustice, to just, being wrongly accused, and harsher punishments and these kinds of things. And I've dealt with so much oppression, and I wonder how much does that research contribute to the current research that's going on in the UK? And what does that look like? Because I'm just so interested. It sounds like there's a lot of progress happening that I'm excited to learn about. I don't hear that term specifically, discrimination, being used. And I wonder, why? Is there something else that I'm missing that?
Yeah, so I think, the grappling with the term discrimination, and I think it's used in conversation, but I think in order to connect with people who can make that difference, it's difficult to, it's very complex, it's quite nuanced there, and you have to work with prisons and work with the justice system to initiate change. So if you go storming in and say you're discriminatory, you're this, you're that, then they'll say, okay, we can't look at our data. we don't want to work with that. And so it's really about fostering those relationships and making them constructive. And a lot of the time you're working with people who really want to help and really want to initiate change, and there's sort of systemic barriers that you have to go through. But I think there's a real shift in the UK in understanding that criminalization and understanding that actually we're putting people with disabilities in prison, we're disadvantaging people from minority groups, we are our prisons are full of people with disabilities, and that's so not right. And we are working on getting that message out there, and it is getting out there slowly. It's just frustrating. Obviously you can't get that out there quicker, but it's sort of in process. And it's all in conversation as well. Like, our priorities as advocates and as researchers are very different from police priorities. And when you engage in conversation with police, for example, they talk about keeping people safe, and they really talk about victim management and things, and they might use tools that identify people who are high risk of committing a crime, which essentially is identifying people who are maybe marginalized, disadvantaged, have disabilities and things. And that's really prone to criminalization, and actually changing that perspective on that is really hard. So it's again just working with people with different priorities and trying to get the message across in a way that's going to be constructive and initiate change from meeting the organizations where they are and saying, this is your priorities now, but can we make this a priority too, and can we feed that in, is really important, just as important as meeting people where they are as well. So I hope that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
I think with the prison system, it wasn't until I started to meet you where I looked, and in the United States, each state has their own rules, but in Connecticut, juvenile courts handle cases for children under the age of 17, but there's no minimum age to be sent to juvenile court. Children as young as 6 years old have been sent to juvenile court and accused of being a delinquent. Delinquency is what the courts call the child who's been, and how young some kids get into this system. And if it happens to be you have a life that doesn't cross this type of thing that, just really unaware. And there's a group in Connecticut, and I've been following them on Instagram, fighting to, not have young children sent to these group situations. We closed it was a children's prison, basically, with very high windows and very difficult situations. And that actually they tried to open it to bring the Afghani refugees in. And the advocates are like, no, we just close that thing. It's like the last thing we're going to do is traumatize people from Afghanistan. Nat, you had a question up. Did you just want to ask your question, and then I'll go to Kara?
Thank you so much. This has been very informative. I think that as much as COVID has presented many challenges, these were many challenges that those of us living with disabilities lived with every day before COVID. And some of the doors that have opened in terms of participation for people with disabilities by the rest of the world accepting, yes, we can zoom in, we can, please turn on the closed captioning. Oh, my Zoom doesn't have closed captioning. Actually, it does. You just have to create the awareness to create that access, and recognizing that has been very important, and helping people to see how we can wear our scarlet letter D for disability as a badge of honor and pride and survival and success. And I have enjoyed these sessions so much because they have brought more voice to a platform that is difficult to discuss, and how we model as we move forward. Let's hope that we don't lose that inclusivity to be exclusion again. Thank you so much.
And I was just thinking, I just checked it, January 2020. Was that when I was trying to 19? I remember us before pandemic trying to put together, we're trying to switch from doing a group phone call to Zoom, and everyone was just like, why do we have to Zoom, and what's Zoom? And, and then now, we've all absolutely, jumped into it, whether one likes it or not. And the ability, and as we move back to in-person things, and people want to charge admission fees, and that the business element comes back into that, we don't lose the option for people that have gotten access because they can do it from their homes. So definitely great point, Nat. Kara, last question for you.
I see a question that was in the chat that and this is someone who is personally a survivor, but also just trying to figure out how, if police are dependent on in like victim statements, but yet these are children, or they're people who have a brain injury and issues with speech and not getting access to care. Just how is, I guess really the overall question is, in terms of victims, but both victims and people and prisoners getting access to care, to speech therapy, or to neuropsych evaluations, and to treatment, and within the justice system. How is that? If Hope has any knowledge about that, that area.
Yeah, so good question. And again, something that's so important, and it goes back to that diagnosis point that we were making before, where if you don't get the diagnosis, and then you don't get access to those pathways of care. So again, it's about introducing the screening earlier. I think particularly in courts as well, that education for lawyers to understand that this is a brain injury and this could be the impact of the brain injury, that education for magistrates to understand the impacts of brain injury, how that might have had an effect both in the situation where the crime happened and also in the court situation, and how that presents in court. And then I also I think that it goes beyond that into people who are advocating on behalf of people with brain injury, people who are the appropriate adult for children, and just really taking the time to make sure that children understand their rights, understand that they can have an appropriate adult, can have a lawyer, and like, it's just so important. It's just like that holistic education for everybody in the justice system, which is beneficial for the staff as well as for the survivors of brain injury too. So we've had instances where we've done training in the justice system and staff have said, gosh, like, I feel so much less burnt out because I feel like I'm not like talking to myself all the time. Like, I understand why somebody's not listening, or why they're not following my instructions, or how I need to break the instructions down to make them more accessible. And that's less frustrating for staff too, because they don't want to be in a situation where they feel like somebody's being defiant, so they then have an argument with somebody and it escalates and escalates, and it really helps to de-escalate everything. So yeah, I think it's holistic, and I think it's all about training and understanding. But in terms of specific access to speech and language therapy and other kinds of therapy in the justice system, that's definitely not my area of expertise, but I'm all for improving accessibility to that and addressing that issue with screening too.
No, I mean, I think that it's important, because I think whether it's the or the lawyers or social workers more so, or the interventionists that come in, for them to have knowledge, because then those are the people that provide access to the care, or to provide, be able to help them get the healthcare and the social services, necessary. So I think that, it's great that the advocates are becoming more aware of this.
Yeah.
And there's also, I mean, there's this, I am watching things be done on video that some trauma work that I didn't think one would do on video, is being that MMDR, they're now companies that will send you a computer and you hook yourself up and you do biofeedback from your home. There's definitely which I think initially, when technology comes, it'll probably be a higher price point, but then as it streams out. So, if we can come up with, treatments for trauma and for improving outcomes from brain injury, and make it virtual, and lower the cost and lower the access, and that is a piece that we haven't had. We haven't had that access in the past. You've had to have a place, have to get to that place, have the barriers between you and getting into that place, and then getting back home again. I know so many people that just the traveling 2 hours for whatever treatment they're going to get is exhausting.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, I remember working in the mental health services, and I worked with specifically patients with long-term health conditions, and I was asked to work over the telephone a few times, and I remember at the start thinking, what do you mean do a mental health session over the telephone? I could never do that. That doesn't sound good. And then actually by the end of it, really having a much deeper understanding of what that accessibility means, and how not having to travel to an appointment would make a huge difference to that person if they were even able to travel to an appointment. And yeah, I think it definitely taught me some valuable lessons in accessibility. So something we should advocate for.
And this is a piece we haven't had in the past. So, where does this take us after the first, layer is scooped off, where people are, for-profit situations, and, bringing that technology, how can then it be expanded out to more people and groups that didn't have access before? So thank you, Hope. And you will see a lot more of Hope. I'm so grateful. There's a lot of things that wouldn't have happened up until now without you, and I'm really excited to have you in this new position moving forward.
Yeah, I'm excited too. Look forward to everything we do in the future. Watch this space.
And next week we will be adding another country. So tune in for next week for a discussion of another global expansion of PINK. And I'm really happy to have Kara here. And baby's not around, is she?
My stepmother's here, so taking care of her.
Can we see the baby for a second?
For the afternoon.
Can we see the baby?
I have to go get her.
Go get her for a second, real quick.
Yeah. Okay.
Kara has a brand new baby girl, Sophie, and Kara and I have been working together, I think like 10 years now. So I sort of feel like auntie. So we just get a peek at baby Sophie, and watching that as women expand their, to parenting with a brain injury, and you know, my 3 were pretty exhausting. I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD then, but just trying to parent and knowing the limitations that I had. She's probably just wrangling the baby all the way. So yeah, we have presentations all the way through April now. I will just let you know real quick. We're going to have, oh, Nat, did you have a question?
Just to everyone and to all, whatever you can do to bring these issues forward to your governing bodies, your legislature, tell your stories, twist the context of the story to help people see things in a different way, often gets our voices to be heard. We had such a struggle trying to pass restraining exclusion from being not happening in the schools. There's the baby. Baby's more important.
Oh,
I'm going to shut up.
Well, and Nat, you just have to come on and be a guest and have a whole bunch of them. She is adorable. Oh my gosh.
Sophia Jordan, my beautiful girl.
I just feel like an auntie, you know?
Already 3 months.
Is she really 3 months old?
Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. Well,
yeah. Her first, she's wearing pink for her first pink meeting.
Oh, that's so cute. Yes. First baby Zoom. And I was just saying while you were getting her that, you know, you have been such a huge part, you and me, for the last decade. You even went to the brain injury awareness last March 2020. You hauled down there to DC, and
I know
the last
that was
one
crazy, and COVID was spreading in my family at the time.
And
too.
I wouldn't go. I did not go. I'm like, I'm not going. You're like, I'm going. So
look how she's watching her.
I did.
She's watching you, Catherine.
Sophia's got her eyes on you.
Hi, Catherine.
She's adorable. Oh, so great. We'll end with the beautiful baby of Sophie. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Hope, and everyone. Take care, and we'll see you all next week.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Girl.